Shabir Ali and David Wood had a debate. This has been several years ago, but I watched it recently and here's my review of it. This debate was very soon after the Islamic extremist fundamentalist terror attack at a military recruiting station in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they had the debate in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So, is the Bible a book of peace? The day before they had a debate about the Quran, and that's on my watch later list, and I'll get around to it very soon. So, yep, those are the backgrounds we need on it. David Wood started out telling this personal story about going from being a sociopath, atheist, to a Christian who's less angry and less eager to beat people up. Such beating of people up has ended him up in prisons and psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric asylums earlier in his life. He gave many examples of early Christians being peaceful and how the early Christians, apart from Jesus' influence, were not peaceful. Some of the apostles saying they should call down fire on a city that would not let Jesus enter it. Things like that, but they were rebuked by Jesus for that. Pointed out that Christianity took a turn towards the violent when Constantine conquered and won the Roman Empire in the name of Christianity. Then it became the state's official religion. And we're talking about the state of Rome, the Roman Empire that conquered many hundreds or thousands of kilometers, from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. And they conquered by being brutal, and that was what owned Christianity at that point, and that's when we see violence in Christianity, not before. And Christianity, David talked about ways Christianity mellowed out the Roman Empire or had a positive influence to push them towards less violence. There's two ways people can look at the Christian scriptures, the Bible, and get violence, and one is by distorting it. If you really don't try to understand any book, you can make it say, you can claim it says anything. Or look at the violent stories from the Old Testament. But those violent stories from the Old Testament, David was saying, they're there in the scriptures because the scriptures are what really happened to people, not because they are a perfect model in all ways. Shabir Ali came up with 4 criteria. Some of them are absolutely ridiculous to decide whether a book is a book of peace. Just for the sake of argument, let's see. When we say book of peace, I'm assuming we mean, what I would mean, what any decent person would mean, a book that teaches you to act peacefully or not peacefully. Anytime we're saying book of a characteristic, then we mean the book is encouraging that characteristic. There are historical books, factual books that tell us what happened in the war, what happened with criminals in the past, and those books are not telling you to do it just because I tell you about it happening. So, Shabir Ali's 4 criteria to decide about whether a book is a book of peace is, how do they treat their heroes? Depending on what you're talking about, you could say a book is not a book of peace if it heaps too much praise on somebody who did bad stuff. Especially if it's heaping praise on them because they did bad stuff. That would be a different thing. If you say this guy did good sometimes, or this guy is a perfect sinless example, and he committed this murder, rape, or if somebody fell off the rails, he was good young and turned bad later. Okay. What are the orders of that book for how to live your life? Of these 4 criteria, that's the only legitimate one that Shabir came up with. Does it give you a just war theory? what does that have to do with whether the individual person is taught to live peacefully or not? Just war theory. Does it give rules for governing? Okay, that doesn't sound like it's encouraging to live peacefully if you have to go conquering. But what does that have to do with teaching you to be peaceful? A book encouraging an individual to live peacefully can teach them principles that will apply in any circumstance. So, Shabir talked about the Old Testament violence, recounted specific stories of it, and claims that the New Testament encourages that just because it does call some of those people who, had something good going on in their lives. Doesn't claim them sinless. Muslims don't believe some of the stories in the Old Testament because they don't believe that the prophets, something like the prophets being able to sin, or at least not doing as bad of stuff as is in the Old Testament. But I differ on that. Those stories in the Old Testament are there because they really happened, because they're real people. Shabir claimed the New Testament encourages violence because at the second coming, Jesus Christ is going to have to clean up this mess. But that's not what I do. That's Jesus cleaning up. And well, that's God. God cleaning things up at the end of time is in a completely different category as opposed to me going out and killing the bad people. Completely different category. It's ridiculous. He claimed that Jesus having his enemies be made his footstool is talking about him walking on their dead bodies. No, it doesn't necessarily mean, when Jesus is going to have his enemies be his footstool, that there's killing of people. Just that they realize who's boss and who is the true and living God and stuff like that. Alright, David pointed out that the heroes in the Old Testament are not there because they're teaching us that they're good people. We could draw a lesson out of that God can use people who have messed up lives. He detailed how some of the bad stuff that the people did is there because they're not sinless, and we don't look at them as perfect sinless examples. The Old Testament used different language. David proved that it didn't really mean kill everyone off sometimes. It was hyperbole. It was to drive the point home. You got beat. Instead of just saying, we won the war, it's we, annihilated them. It's somewhat like some sports fans use. In sports, there are definitely instances where a happy fan about their team winning says, we killed them, but nobody died. Very happy sports fans that their team's winning frequently say stuff like, we killed them, we slaughtered them, but everybody survives the incident. How often do the sports fans say, well, we won more, we scored more points than them? David pointed out Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. That's why he doesn't need to tell us what laws to force and enact on other people. His commandments are applicable, usable in all circumstances. Oh boy. I think I see a stink bug. I did see a stink bug, and I'm catching it right now. Okay, I did my part to end the stink bug outbreak. Now you can do your part and catch a stink bug in your house. Okay, Yep, David gave the example of love your enemies and love all people. I can do that no matter how anarchical. Well, I could do that in a state of anarchy where there's no government or where we don't know what the laws are. I could do that in the most oppressive, living under the most oppressive regime in the history of the world. I can do that because it's, followable in all governments. David made the point. His problem with Islam, he's talked about Muhammad conquering, but that's not the real underlying reason that he does speeches like this and has a YouTube channel that has a lot of videos pointing out the errors in Islam, or reasons that he thinks Islam is wrong. It's because it's a false religion in David Wood's opinion. That's his motivating belief that gets him going, making these videos. Not because, he thinks it's a good religion or true religion in every other way except Muhammad conquering. Shabir pointed out that the Quran does not tell violent details about David. So it lies about King David. How's that? I thought they were supposed to debate the Bible, but not being honest about somebody, how does that make you worthy to be called a book of peace or not? Or he claims Joshua and Judges must have been written by different writers, and that's why there it talks like a city was destroyed, and then the people are still there years later to be a menace. So when David says it's hyperbole, Shabir says it's just two different people writing whatever they want and there's no truth to it. Yep, and that's how we end up with violent and peaceful things, according to Shabir. In the previous debate, David had used the word something like, "I like it when the Islamic State kills people." And he was being sarcastic. The audience let Shabir know that was sarcasm. Shabir did not realize it. Maybe he still doesn't believe David was being sarcastic when David said that. It's obvious to me from the tone of voice and everything else I've heard David say that was sarcastic when David said that. David is not dependent on Islamic violence for him to have a disagreement with the Quran. He's got some reasons that errors he sees in the Quran and Islam without the violence happening. Accused David of agreeing with the violent scholars. But what if the violent scholars are right? That's not a proof one way or the other. You agree with somebody, but you still didn't prove if they're right or wrong about this thing. That's interpretation. Okay, Shabir claimed that Quran Surah 9, which is the last surah in chronological order, which shows you how out of order the Quran is from chronological order. He claimed it's only for the violence, the fighting there, is only for unbelievers in God. And so if you're a Christian or an atheist who believes in God, you're safe from that violence if the people obey the Quran. And there's a big list of other things that you have to meet all of these criteria. If there's one criteria on the list you don't meet, then you're off limits. They aren't supposed to get violent against you. That seemed bizarre to me. I thought if you're a Christian or a Jew, religious Christian or religious Jew, that means you believe. David pointed out, talked about how the hyperbole more, how it's hyperbole when the Old Testament looks like everybody was killed off in a city. Points out that Jericho was a military outpost, and that's why they did literally kill everybody there, because they were conquering a military outpost. David gave a hypothetical scenario. What if there's somebody who reads the Old Testament, as a Christian, reads the Old Testament about killing the Canaanites and decides he wants to go do it? we could show him, according to David, we could show him how now we don't do that. It's a new covenant, new commandments, updates from God. But if there's a peaceful Muslim, once peaceful Muslim, who decides he's going to wage war against the unbelievers, like Quran 9 says, then we don't have anything we could really say to refute him, because according to David Wood's understanding, Surah 9, chapter 9, does call for fighting people who don't believe, not for, not the peaceful interpretation Shabir says. He pointed out that Samson is not a moral hero. We don't draw pictures of Samson and color in pictures of Samson in Sunday school because we're thinking he is sinless. We need to be like him in every way. No, it's like God's powerful and he can use people that are sinners too. Shabir claimed that the just war theory is not biblical. He claimed the book of Romans in the New Testament praises Rome, that violent empire, that crucified Jesus for things that Jesus did not say, according to Shabir. And he talked about how in Surah 9, there is an option to get out of Muslims fighting you if you're of those categories that it tells them to fight against. And that's paying jizya. That's fine. It's not a tax. A tax is something that everybody pays equally. It's a fine if it's more money, or it's money because you're doing something bad. David pointed out the jizya is there for humiliation. It's not. It's there to force somebody to be humiliated. So you're still not. David's pointing that out was you're still not giving somebody equal treatment. It's not peaceful to be mean to people, and it's being mean to people. David pointed out in Quran Surah 9 that it says Allah. It really means believing the way Muslims believe about God, not just believing that there is a God. One proof of that is in that surah, it accuses Christians of believing Jesus is the Son of God, and we do. And it accused Jews of believing that Ezra is the son of God, which I have never heard anywhere outside of the Quran, or people quoting the Quran. I don't think the Jews really believe there's somebody who's the son of God. Yep, he gave examples of people, nations, tribes who were supposedly annihilated by the Jews in the Old Testament, but just same chapter or a few chapters later or somewhere else in the Old Testament were back. They obviously were not all killed off if they came back. Evidence of hyperbole. And he pointed out in Paul's, one thing we can learn from one of St. Paul, the Apostle Paul's interactions. I called him St. Paul, I shouldn't have. I don't like to use the word saint like that. The Apostle Paul's interactions with some people in the government is God gives the government the power to punish people and a duty to do the right thing. Shabir thinks it's so unpeaceful that the New Testament leaves the law giving and punishing for bad stuff to others. Okay, so if I don't go chop off somebody's head, vigilante style, how's that unpeaceful? That was such a stupid, bad point. Accused the Old Testament of genocide when David proved that it was hyperbole. Claimed Muhammad used the just war theory, and then said something ridiculous. Because Muhammad did not attack until he had power. What Shabir would have needed to do to prove that Muhammad used the just war theory is show proof that the Meccans were on the warpath, showed proof that the Meccans were intolerant of other religions. But the Meccans had no problem with hundreds, literally hundreds of other people with hundreds of other gods. They peacefully coexisted there. Some of the historical reports I've heard of talk about Muhammad sending out caravan raids, raiding caravans. That's not peaceful. Stealing caravans, stealing stuff, violently stealing things is not peaceful. So, it's not an unjust war on the part of Meccans if those historical reports are true that Muhammad sent out attacks. And that makes no sense because then so it's peaceful if you go on the attack once you have an army, but it's not peaceful if you do it small scale. I would think the scale of something should not be used to define whether it's peaceful or not. It's whether it's peaceful or not. They got to a question and answer session. And there's a question about whether the Old Testament could be interpreted peacefully too, because the Old Testament was only telling the Israelites to go conquer a certain limited area and not telling them to go conquer the whole world. And their fights after they conquered that area were just defensive. And David said that's a good, like a distinctive take on it, distinction. Yeah, that's an important distinction David was pointing out, that the person asking the question about whether Israel was commanded in the Old Testament to conquer the whole world or just go get this one small piece of land over there. And we can see in the Old Testament, God was warning Israel they needed to behave or they would have the same thing happen to them that they were being told by God to do to the others. And that David pointed out that Jesus was quoting Leviticus, the book at the beginning of the Bible, when he said, love your neighbor. So that's a very peaceful thing there, being commanded to love your neighbor. Well, David didn't want to speak too much about that subject because he's a Christian and he doesn't want to comment too much for Jews or try to tell Jews how to interpret their scriptures. Shabir claimed that Jesus Christ is the Davidic Messiah, and so he needed to rule and conquer the Romans, and that's the only thing the Davidic Messiah could mean. But not if God's kingdom is not of this world. And he says you can see the violent remains of Jesus' original plan to be conquering as the Davidic Messiah in the New Testament. Then there was a question about whether George Bush and the United States military going into Iraq was a just war. And David made a small comment on the just war principle. And one reason that theory exists is to explain when a war is just and when it isn't. So it is possible for there to be a just war to happen. Let's see, in Shabir, claimed everybody, Shabir did not think that going into Iraq was the just war, and he claims spreading ideas is not a just war, but it was a good idea for Muhammad to spread a just war, to spread ideas. Okay, that comment knocked down my respect for Shabir Ali a few notches. Look, if spreading ideas is a just war, it's not a just war. It shouldn't be for Muhammad either. Shabir Ali was inconsistent there. He claimed because now we have democracy. Okay, well, one of the claimed reasons for going into Iraq was to help them have democracy. So, if you don't take out a dictator, you're not going to get those, had that democracy that he was just saying was a good thing. Next question. Somebody claimed that Spain for 800 years, when the Muslims were ruling it, was so perfectly peaceful and everyone had their equal rights. And Shabir Ali, people can misuse some of the books, and there have been violent people who did things violently because of the Bible. And David was something about, should have taken bigger notes. Okay, David Woods, and he claimed that Saladin was more merciful, the Saladin of the Crusades time period, 1000 AD plus or minus a couple hundred years, Saladin. I don't know, I like learning about history, but off the top of my head I'm not remembering the exact year that Saladin was running things down there. Saladin was more merciful than the Christians at that time were. Let's see. And let's see. David Wood does some interpreting of the Bible, as he was claiming. David said he would disagree about some of the historical claims, but didn't go into details. But yeah, we've got some historical evidence that the basic fundamental human rights of non-Muslims in Spain in that time period were not honored, that they were subjugated, that they were, being violated. But that wasn't the subject of this debate, so maybe that's why David didn't go into details about that. But the whole point of this debate, David pointed out, was the text of the books. Does the text tell you to be violent or not violent? Not how have people acted on it, because people can act differently than what their book says. But he pointed out that Islam began with Muhammad, Abu Bakr, not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but the other Abu Bakr, Uthman and Ali, and I think he named all four later guided caliphs. Abu Bakr, Uthman, who was the fourth one? Anyway, so Islam started out with all of them on the warpath right away. They did not try just peacefully coexisting, forgiving the Meccans and sending out missionaries to spread the peaceful message. They were on the warpath, raiding caravans right away. Christianity, any violence in Christianity started 300 and something AD. Until then, Christians were, adopting orphans. David's found examples of Christians selling themselves into slavery to have money to donate to poor people or other charity, things that could be called charity. And so David's point there was those most likely to know what a book is saying, what the message of the book is, are probably the people closer to when the book came out. So those early Christians, they had the Bible, or we didn't have the Bible compiled together the way it is now until 300 and something, but the early Christians were closer to the teachings of Jesus in time scale. And that book that became the Bible, the parts of it were floating around and being passed around and read at that time. So the Christians that were not, back then, they most likely had the correct understanding of the book. The Muslims, at the time, the guy who gave the book, received the book from God. And his followers, right after that, who knew him personally, who were alive when he was alive, they are most likely to be the ones who correctly understand what that book meant. There's a question for David Wood. How can you say the final marching orders are peace when in Matthew 10:13 it says to give peace, and if people don't believe or accept it, you take away peace? And why did Peter have a sword? That was two questions. And so David pointed out when it talks about taking peace, I'm not sure if that's the best translation of that. And even if that is a good translation, it does not mean kill, beat up, be violent against them. It's just that peace can have more than one meaning. In that verse, the peace means that peace of inner heart, the peace of having the gospel, like a blessing, which has nothing to do with killing somebody or stealing from them as a punishment for them not believing. That verse tells them to leave. Do nothing to them other than take the peace. The peace there meaning like a blessing. And Jesus explained that he told his apostles to grab swords so that the prophecy would be fulfilled that he was numbered among the transgressors. That's why Jesus said to grab swords. And they had 2 swords, and Jesus said that would be enough. Unless you think Jesus was claiming to have, like, superpowers and he was going to, conquer, like, imagine superheroes we have now, like Superman would have been able to do, then obviously he did not mean an open rebellion and actually overthrowing Rome with 2 swords. Next question. In the Quran, Shabir had his response. In the Quran, Jesus is peaceful, he claims. Yeah, but the Quran's not giving us accurate information about Jesus. Claimed the New Testament has 2 layers, and there are scholars who have examples of violence in the New Testament, actually. One of those scholars, he's citing made-up stuff that isn't in the New Testament. He claimed maybe Jesus was trying to have a non-violent revolution. I hope Shabir will one day open his eyes and realize Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, so he was not trying to conquer Rome. That was never his plan. There's a question for David. The text of the Quran, does it support ISIS? David's opening statement, maybe he said something like that. And accused David of not giving any proof of bad things happening and evidence of bad things happening in Muslim-majority countries or violence in Muslim-majority countries, and wanted to talk about World War I and World War II and whether there are dictatorships in the Muslim world that are being supported by the West, and something about sad violence that's happening in Central Africa. Like people being burned every day, he said. But David's said, so the question is, why when we're debating whether something is a book of peace, we don't talk about the war? It's irrelevant. Yes, that was an excellent point by David. People's actions do not change the text. And the debate was about whether the book is, meaning the book teaches to be violent or not violent. And he only brought up ISIS to show there are multiple views. ISIS looks at the Quran one way, Shabir Ali looks at it another way. There's different ways to look at the same book. And the earliest generation in any religion is the least influenced by outside influences. So any Muslim anywhere in the world now has more than just Islam influencing what they do, especially if they're living outside of a Muslim majority country. Somebody asked a question that had nothing to do with the topic. And then somebody asked a question, so the Bible talks about having true peace in your heart, but Jesus is going to judge us, the Bible says, and there is no peace for the wicked. David's response to that is there's different meanings of the word peace. Peace with, yeah, so there's, when we're defining whether a book is a book of peace, it means peace with others. Does it tell you to live peacefully with others? Not is not anything about your internal peace. And Islam, David pointed out, in Islam, they believe Jesus is going to come back at the end of time and kick butt. That's my wording, my translator, my interpretation of what he's saying. But no, Jesus is going to judge and get violent at the end of the world, according to Islam. So if you don't like violent Jesus, then you really should not like Islam. You point out atheists should love this commandment because they don't believe Jesus is real, or he wasn't a god and he's never going to come back. And so Christians have a never-ending command to not judge you. If, atheists should look at it that way. That's an interesting point, yeah. Since Jesus is going to judge at the end of the world and be the one to, kill off the extremely bad people that need to be killed off, I'm not doing it. I'm told to live peacefully. And Shabir said, if Christians will not touch, Christians won't touch the violent or the criminals, then, and so he is reiterating the point that he thinks you can't call a book of peace if it doesn't tell you how to run the government, which is completely different from running your personal life. Question for Shabir. Let's see, in the intro he talked about God making enemies, Jesus' enemies his footstool. If everyone who is not following God is an enemy to God, then it will be just for God to punish people when he returns. Shabir said it's a responsibility of God. He gave a hypothetical example where somebody who digs a hole in the ground has a responsibility to put fences around it so people don't fall in and get hurt. And he talked about God might forgive people, and it's an Islamic concept of God to forgive people. Wow, yep, and that's one. Shabir's response here made no sense to me. It's not God gets to judge us. At the end of the world, at Judgment Day, there's nothing wrong with God. Sinless, creator, all that stuff. Coming and judging, getting violent against people for whom that's the right thing to, against whom it's the right thing to do. Why would Shabir not just say that? But then he talks about God forgiving people that are really bad and don't merit any forgiveness. That's not a just judge. That's not anyone worth following if he's going to forgive without punishing people. He claimed the Islamic Jesus is not violent because he's not the Davidic Messiah. The Davidic Messiah does not mean what Shabir was saying it means. And David had a point to answer to that. Let's see. Oh yeah, the Quran actually has a verse that says that God put mercy and kindness and love in Christians' hearts. So Shabir just denounced the Quran by claiming that Christians only talked about being nice to avoid execution by the Romans. David brought up the story about a World War II soldier who saw somebody in one of the Pacific Islands reading a Bible, and the soldier said to him, "We educated people don't believe that anymore." And the person reading it said to him that it's a good thing for him that he believed that book, because if he did not believe the Bible, he would be eating that American soldier. And that is my summary of the debate about whether the Bible is a book of peace. Have a good day.